Welcome to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. In this video, we are going to discuss the quintessential cards needed to build the core of a graveyard-centric commander deck with Meren of Clan Nel Toth as the general. Meren of Clan Nel Toth debuted as the front-facing commander of the Plunder the Graves pre-constructed EDH deck from the Commander 2015 product. Meren is a 3/4 human shaman for 2 in Golgari colors. That's 1 black mana and 1 green mana. Whenever another creature we control dies, we get an experience counter. Note that this ability triggers whenever any creature we control dies, and not just non-token creatures. At the beginning of our end step, we choose target creature card in our graveyard. If that card's mana value is less than or equal to the number of experience counters we have, then we return it to the battlefield. Otherwise, we put it into our hand. Meren's recursive ability allows us to utilize our graveyard as a source for various game-dependent abilities, all of which are tied to our creatures' enter the battlefield triggers. As such, we are tasked with inundating the core of this build with ways to fill our graveyard with creatures that have diverse and/or redundant enter the battlefield triggers. Since self-sacrifice is a reliable way for us to fill our graveyard, we plan to include creatures with various leave the battlefield triggers as well. For the purposes of optimizing this dynamic, some peripheral self-sacrifice benefits will be added to the core of this build. Through this leave the battlefield and enter the battlefield engine led by Meren, we will control the game and our opponents on the path to imminent victory. We begin the core of this build with a slew of creatures with interactive enter the battlefield triggers. When Fleshbag Marauder and Merciless Executioner come into play, each player sacrifices a creature. Gravelighter either draws us a card if a creature died this turn, or has each player sacrifice a creature. Demon's Disciple extends its sacrifice fodder to either creatures or planeswalkers. Plaguecrafter does the same, and for each creature who cannot make the sacrifice, they discard a card. Note that each of these creatures can be sacrificed to their own enter the battlefield trigger, which serves the purposes of gaining experience counters through Meren and managing our opponent's sides of the battlefield. For targeted creature removal, Shriekmaw destroys target non-black, non-artifact creature when it comes into play. Ravenous Chupacabra destroys target creature an opponent controls. For potential mass creature removal, Massacre Worm gives creatures our opponents control -2/-2 until end of turn when it comes into play. As a bonus, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, that player loses 2 life. Reclamation Sage allows us the option to destroy target artifact or enchantment, while Acidic Slime has us destroy target artifact, enchantment, or land. Now that we have addressed our opponent's sides of the battlefield, let's turn our attention to ours. The following creatures advance our board state through enter the battlefield triggers. When Farhaven Elf comes into play, we search our library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Primeval Herald does the same when it comes into play or whenever it attacks. Wood Elves puts a forest card into play. Note that this forest card does not have to be a basic land. Springbloom Druid allows us the option of sacrificing a land when it comes into play. If we do, then we search our library for 2 basic lands and put them onto the battlefield tapped. Eternal Witness puts target card from our graveyard into our hand. When Disciple of Bolas comes into play, we sacrifice another creature to gain X life and draw X cards, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. Through Sidisi Undead Vizier's exploit mechanic, we may sacrifice a creature, and if we do, then we search our library for a card and put it into our hand. Note that Sidisi can exploit herself if needed. Izoni, Thousand-Eyed, creates a 1/1 black and green insect creature token for each creature card in our graveyard. We also can pay a black and a green mana and sacrifice another creature to gain 1 life and draw a card. Avenger of Zendikar creates a 0/1 green plant creature token for each land we control. Through its landfall mechanic, we put a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature we control whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control. Remember, creature tokens dying give us experience counters through Meren, and each of these two creatures can create oodles of creature tokens. Through Meren's recursive ability, Grey Merchant of Asphodel can drain our opponent's life totals over and over again. When it comes into play, each opponent loses X life, where X is our devotion to black. We gain life equal to the life lost this way. To factor our devotion to black, we count the number of black mana symbols and the mana costs of permanents we control. As Gary ping-pongs back and forth from the graveyard to the battlefield, a chasm-like discrepancy in life totals should develop, easily leading us to victory over our opponents. So far, we have added creatures with valuable enter the battlefield triggers into this build. Now, let's include some creatures with valuable leave the battlefield triggers, as well as some cards with peripheral leave the battlefield benefits. As always, we begin with opponent interaction. We can sacrifice Spore Frog to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. We can pay 1 and a green mana and sacrifice Caustic Caterpillar to destroy target artifact or enchantment. We can pay 1 and sacrifice Cankerbloom to either destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, or proliferate. Note that we can proliferate our experience counters this way. We can pay a green mana and sacrifice Haywire Might to exile target non-creature artifact or non-creature enchantment. We also gain 2 life when this insect dies. Note that the target card is exiled and not destroyed. Returning cards from the graveyard is easier than Sunday morning. Returning cards from exile is a feat that is as rare as winter roses. When Junji the Midnight Sky dies, we either have each opponent discard 2 cards and lose 2 life, or we put target non-dragon creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under our control, and we lose 2 life. Whenever a creature we control dies, Dictative Erebus has each opponent sacrifice a creature. In this build, there should be few instances in which our opponent's sides of the battlefield are teeming with creatures. For the purposes of advancing our board state, Pitiless Plunderer accelerates our mana by creating a treasure token whenever another creature we control dies. Note that this ability triggers when our token creatures die as well. We can sacrifice Secura Tribe Elder to search our library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Viridian Emissary does the same when it dies. Yavimaya Elder follows suit, but allows us the option of searching our library for 2 basic lands instead of 1. We also can pay 2 and sacrifice this human druid to draw a card. Speaking of drawing cards, whenever another non-token creature we control dies, Grim Haruspex draws us a card. Moldervine Reclamation follows suit, except it is triggered whenever any creature we control dies, and we gain 1 life in addition to drawing a card. When Protean Hulk dies, we search our library for any number of creature cards with total mana value of 6 or less and put them onto the battlefield. When Kokusho the Evening Star dies, each opponent loses 5 life and we gain life equal to the life lost this way. Through the sacrifice recursion theme of this build, Protean Hulk could put a lot of creatures into play straight from our library, and Kokusho can gain us a lot of life. Remember all of the various sacrifice abilities we showcased earlier in this video? Well, our opponents will never forget, especially if Mazarek, Kral Deathpriest, or Turgid God of Fright are on our side of the battlefield. Whenever a player sacrifices a permanent, we put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control. Mazarek also has flying, which makes this insect shaman a potentially big evasive threat through the air. Whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent or discards a permanent card, Turgid puts that card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under our control instead. The backside of this card is Turgid's Lantern, a legendary artifact that can tap and have target player lose 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card. Let's not overlook how helpful this activated ability can be, secondary to revving up our sacrifice recursion engine. We also can pay 3 and a black mana to untap Turgid's Lantern, an ability not welcomed by our opponents. Since our graveyard is pivotal to utilizing our general's experience counter-dependent ability, we must ensure that our creatures can get into the graveyard as much as possible. For sacrifice outlets, Viscera Seer, Carrion Feeder, Yahenni Undying Partisan, and Yawgmoth Thran Physician fill this need splendidly. Viscera Seer lets us scry 1, we put a +1/+1 counter on Carrion Feeder, Yahenni gains indestructible until end of turn, and whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, Yahenni gets a +1/+1 counter. For Yawgmoth, we pay 1 life and sacrifice another creature in order to put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature, and we draw a card. We also may pay 2 black mana and discard a card to proliferate. Remember, we can proliferate our experience counters if needed. Continuing with our sacrifice outlets is Phyrexian Altar. It adds 1 mana of any color, while Altar of Dementia has target player mill cards from the top of their library equal to the sacrifice creature's power. This ability serves our theme very, very well. If we pay 2 life and sacrifice another creature, then Razaketh the Foul-Blooded allows us to search our library for a card and put it into our hand. This on-theme, demonic tutor-like ability adds tremendous value to the core of this build. Evolutionary Leap is another repeatable sacrifice effect, but it costs a green mana to activate each time. When we do, we sacrifice a creature and reveal cards from the top of our library until we reveal a creature card. We put that card into our hand, and the rest on the bottom of our library in a random order. There are even lands that synergize with our graveyard theme. We can tap High Market and Phyrexian Tower to sacrifice creatures, and respectively, as additional boni, we gain life and add black mana to our mana pool. At the beginning of our end step, Braid's Arisen Nightmare allows us the option of sacrificing an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker we control. If we do, then each opponent has the option of sacrificing a permanent that shares a card type with it. For each opponent who doesn't, that player loses 2 life and we draw a card. Through this dynamic, we can get creatures into our graveyard and we benefit from it peripherally either through our opponent's own sacrifices, their loss of life, or our card draw. With Jarad Golgari Lichlord, we can pay 1 black and a green mana and sacrifice another creature to have each opponent lose life equal to the sacrificed creature's power. Jarad gets +1/+1 for each creature card in our graveyard, and we can sacrifice a swamp and a forest to return Jarad from our graveyard to our hand. Due to the ability to frequently ramp in this build, we would have expendable resources to recur Jarad, particularly if we need a sacrifice outlet or some global life drain. For one-and-done sacrifice effects, Village Rites is the gold standard. As an additional cost to cast the spell, we sacrifice a creature to draw 2 cards. Altar's Reap does the same. Deadly Dispute and Costly Plunder follow suit, but extend their sacrifice requirement to include artifacts as an option. Deadly Dispute also creates a treasure token. Sacrificing creatures is not the only way to fill our graveyard for targets for Meren. We have spells and abilities that can put creature cards from our library directly into our graveyard. Entomb searches for any card, Unmarked Grave searches for a non-legendary card, Buried Alive searches for up to 3 creature cards, and Jarad's Orders searches for up to 2 creature cards, one of which goes right into our hand. If we were to draw a card, Underrealm Lich's ability has us look at the top 3 cards of our library instead. We put one of these cards into our hand and the rest into our graveyard. It does not provide the options secondary to the aforementioned library searching instant and sorcery spells, but it is a repeatable ability that triggers whenever we draw a card, an effect that could yield very beneficial results in this type of build. Sacrificing creatures and putting cards from our library into our graveyard are not our only options for stockpiling targets for Meren. We can pay a green mana and discard a creature card to activate Survival of the Fittest's ability, which allows us to search our library for a creature card, reveal it, and put it into our hand. Fauna Shaman does the same, except we must tap her and pay a green mana in order to activate her ability. We also can discard creature cards through Greater Good. We sacrifice a creature to draw cards equal to that creature's power, and then we discard 3 cards. It's time to close out this video with a sampling of additional cards that synergizes with and enhances our graveyard theme. At the beginning of each upkeep, Belladros Witherbloom creates expendable 1/1 black and green pest creature tokens that gain us 1 life when they die. These creature tokens are perfect fodder for increasing our number of experience counters through Meren. With numerous death triggers inundating the core of this build, it makes sense to include Drivnod Carnage Dominus. If a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent we control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. We also can put an indestructible counter on Drivnod by paying 2 black Phyrexian mana and exiling 3 creature cards from our graveyard. Black Phyrexian mana can be paid with 2 life or 1 black mana. Drivnod's inclusion makes cards like Kakusho the Evening Star, Junji the Midnight Sky, Pitiless Plunderer, and Dictative Erebus even more backbreaking for our opponents. We can get the best of both worlds by casting Victimize. We choose 2 target creature cards in our graveyard, sacrifice a creature, and then return the chosen creatures to the battlefield tapped. Living Death follows suit, except it swaps each player's creatures that are on the battlefield with the creatures in their graveyard. Caution must be exercised when deciding to cast this spell. Although we have numerous creatures that can remove our opponent's creatures from the battlefield, we must remain mindful of what's lurking in our opponent's graveyards. We can allay most of these concerns by casting Rise of the Dark Realms instead. We put all creature cards from all graveyards onto the battlefield under our control. Since sacrificing our creatures is a feature of this build, let's punish our opponents further by including some cards with life drain and life gain abilities. Whenever another creature dies, Poison Tip Archer has each opponent lose 1 life. When Zilliport Cutthroat or another creature we control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and we gain 1 life. Blood Artist has target player lose 1 life and we gain 1 life whenever she or another creature dies. Whenever a creature we control dies, the Meat Hook Massacre has each opponent lose 1 life. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, we gain 1 life. We can cast this card for just 2 black mana, or we can pay an additional X to give each creature -X/-X when this enchantment enters the battlefield. Versatility and thematic synergy reigns supreme with the Meat Hook Massacre, as its -X/-X ability serves our build well, but also can remove our opponent's creatures from the battlefield. Remember, this -X/-X effect does not target any creatures, so protection like Hexproof and Shroud do not save them, and neither does Indestructible. Sir Conrad the Grim has a host of abilities that fit the theme of this build perfectly. Whenever another creature dies, or whenever a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or whenever a creature card leaves our graveyard, Sir Conrad deals 1 damage to each opponent. He also has a built-in global mill ability for 1 and 1 black mana. This Human Knight acts as a win condition here, particularly due to the various ways we can put creature cards into our graveyard. Speaking of win conditions, Sheoldred Whispering One provides some Meren-like redundancy, just in case our general is languishing in the command zone due to overtaxation, or is otherwise indisposed. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player sacrifices a creature. At the beginning of our upkeep, we return target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. Note that these sacrifice triggers cannot be prevented by protection from black, indestructible, hexproof, or shroud. Mikaeus the Unhallowed lends a helping hand when it comes to creature recursion as well. Other non-human creatures we control get +1/+1 and have Undying, and whenever a human deals damage to us, we destroy it. When a creature with Undying dies, if it had no +1/+1 counters on it, then we return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter. The bulk of our creatures are non-humans, so we will realize the benefits of Mikaeus' Undying enablement. Even more so if we plan to include Woodfall Primus. When it enters the battlefield, we destroy target non-creature permanent. It has Persist, which means when it dies, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, then we return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter. Alongside Mikaeus and a repeatable sacrifice outlet like Altar of Dementia, each time Woodfall Primus is sacrificed, both the Undying and Persist abilities trigger. We choose the order of the triggers on the stack. The first one resolves and sends Woodfall Primus back to the battlefield with either a +1/+1 or -1/-1 counter. The second ability does not resolve because Woodfall Primus is already on the battlefield, and it just fizzles away. We sacrifice it again, which triggers the other ability. We can repeat this process over and over by alternating the +1/+1 and -1/-1 counters from Woodfall Primus's Undying and Persist mechanics. Through this dynamic, we destroy all of our opponent's non-creature permanents, including their lands, while also milling 5 or 7 cards each time. The game should end soon after. Hopefully, our relationships with our opponents will not. This video provided a blueprint for building the core of a graveyard-centric commander deck with Meren of Clan Nel Toth as the general. The cards showcased during this video are suggested options for crafting the thematic core of a graveyard-centric EDH deck, in addition to providing ways of optimizing this theme. Removal spells, disruption, ramp, and the land base can vary from build to build, and also are dependent on metagame preferences and availability. In building around videos like this one, these deck components are left in the hands of each individual deck brewer. If you found this video appealing, then be sure to check out our other building around videos through the playlist on your screen. Also be sure to check out our other deck building series, and don't forget to let me know your thoughts about the core of this graveyard-centric Meren build in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.